My guest today is Dr. Sarah McKay, and she is a neuroscientist, author, and science communicator passionate about making brain science accessible and practical. With a PhD in neuroscience, she specializes in exploring the female brain and its transformations across life stages. Her books, The Women's Brain Book and Baby Brain, delve into the neuroscience of health, hormones, and motherhood. She's also the director of the Neuroscience Academy, bridging the gap between cutting-edge research and everyday life. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's lovely to have you here, and I'm really excited to delve into your work and neuroscience and the impact, especially on women in midlife and beyond. But first of all, what inspired you to transition from laboratory research to science communication?
I always was very interested in lots of things within science and lots of things within neuroscience, and I still am. Neuroscience has been my jam since I was a first year of my undergraduate degree. But the further I got through my science career, the more I started missing learning a little bit about a lot of things. And when you become a postdoc and then you kind of progress through your research career, I kind of joke, you have to become an expert in a really narrow field. You feel like you've become an expert in almost nothing. And I just had a whole lot of FOMO. And even when I was in my PhD research lab, that was in Oxford, there were some very smart people around me, and they were reading, they were so excited every week when the Journal of Neuroscience came out. But I was into the New Scientist and Scientific American, because I just like that global, bigger picture perspective. Like, what does the science mean for everyone else? I guess I just still wanted to feel like I mattered to other people as well, maybe. And so that was when I kind of made that leap. I mean, academia out is always takes a lot of soul searching, but I just wanted to work more in the space of talking about the neuroscience, because I just really like talking about the science to other people who are interested in listening, and there were less opportunities to do that in academia than there were in science communication. So I made that leap, and it was right around the time I was pregnant with my first son. That's really weird.
We can cut that out, but something's coming over your speakers.
It's not in my house, though. There's no one here. There's no one
in our brain, right? We have wiring in our brain, and
I wonder if
the wiring can be efficient, meaning that the connections are as short as possible. Use the shortest route to get there. Turns out that measure of efficiency may very well change in the perimenopause and persist into the postmenopause. So these are some hypotheses, cross-sectional hypotheses.
It's definitely at your end, because you just turned it down.
I think that is that. Do you know that is Pauline Mackey's voice? Do you know who Pauline Mackey is?
No.
Pauline Mackey is a It must be in my. How can I have I've opened up my computer and I have nothing open.
You have to go.
Let me just quit. I'm just going to go into my Finder and quit everything that's not this Chrome.
Let's. Shall we start this again? And then
just a minute. Let me go to force quit. I'll quit everything that's not. That's so weird, because I know that's Pauline Mackey, who's a menopause cognitive brain researcher. But that's really weird, because I haven't got any other. I've got like Riverside, and I've got my email open. I'll quit my calendar. That's so weird.
That was very weird. That's never happened to me before.
No, me neither. But I don't know what the man's voice was.
Very weird.
All right. I've closed everything off.
There's also a funny sort of tick, tick, tick noise in the background.
My phone's on. It's like it was coming in and going out, though. How weird.
I know.
Anyway, right. Okay.
We won't start again then. If you think you've, but you don't. I
think I've got rid of it. I put my phone's on airplane mode. I've quit everything except for Chrome, and the only other I'll close my email. And I've got a Word document. Weird.
That was very weird.
Pauline Mackey. Huh. Oh, well, we'll talk about Pauline Mackey. She clearly wants to be part of this. We'll bring Pauline Mackey up.
That's so funny.
She's very important in this space.
Is she?
Yeah.
But there's also a kind of tick, tick, tick noise in the background, as if there's an insect.
That's the Australian animals out the window.
Is it? I did think perhaps it was the Australian animals. I thought it was.
The cicadas, yeah, sorry. Australian birds are very loud.
Yeah.
Do you want me to...
No, it's all right. It's okay. We'll keep as long as I know what it is now. It's not some technology problem. Okay, I think I can probably do a cut on that. I can probably do that, but we'll just carry on. But yeah. Okay.
So where were we at?
You were just talking about why you'd moved into science communication.
Oh, yeah,
I'm going to move on, and I'm going to ask, was that also why you were inspired to write your books?
Okay.
All right?
Yeah,
so
cool.
I'm going to go for that. Okay, you ready?
Yep, go.
So was that also what inspired you to write your books?
Well, that came much further down the track. So I had probably been working doing science communication for about sort of 9 or 10 years. And I hadn't actually ever considered women's health at all. And then I was approached by a book publisher who's now my agent. She's very charismatic and persuasive lady, Jean Rickmans. And she just rang up one day in it was sort of mid 2016 and said, "Hey, do you want to write a book?" And I went, "No, that sounds like lots of work. And I was thinking, I don't really have any good ideas. And I knew you needed a very clear idea." She said, "Well, let's meet and chat." And she said, "Well, what have you ever written that is, that an audience has really resonated with?" And that was easy because I was writing for the ABC here in Australia at the time. And I had just written an article that went up on Facebook for a brain blog that I was doing for the ABC on menopause and brain fog. Is this the first sign of dementia? And usually we might get like 10 comments or something. And we had like hundreds of comments and thousands of shares. It just went like bonkers. And it is so funny because if you look back, so this was 2015 when I wrote that, and that Facebook post is there. You can't link through to the article, but you can still read the comments. It's like looking back 100 years in time to see how the menopause conversation has changed. And that's really funny, right? So so I told Jean that, and she said, "Well, why don't you write a book on menopause?" And I was like, at the time I was 40, and I was like, I'm not, that's like something that happens like when you're really old. And then she said,
been there, had that thought.
Yeah. And I was like, that would be weird. And then she said, I'm glad I didn't pursue that because we didn't know very much then as compared to what we know now, and at least from a neuroscience perspective. And then she said, "Well, what about baby brain?" And I dismissed that as well. I said, "Well, that's, not a real thing. There's no kind of adaptive benefit whereby pregnancy and motherhood would make you stupid." But then because she'd said and so I have now written a whole book on that. But it was really because she kind of said menopause and she kind of said pregnancy, and I went, and then I was like, I've never thought about women's health through that neuroscience perspective before, and I knew immediately what was the most important thing to me was to take that lifespan perspective, because we can't look at any point in the lifespan when we're thinking about the brain without taking a look at kind of how we got there and looking at all of these stages we go through in life, and I was thinking, we could talk about the neurobiology of puberty, what happens during the menstrual cycle. We could look at anxiety and depression, the kind of the higher rates of that in girls than boys, women than men, teenage brain, or we can look at baby brain and pregnancy. We can look at menopause. We can look at dementia. We can look at Alzheimer's disease and aging. And so very quickly that idea kind of, she said, "Well, go home and write a book outline." And the book outline was great fun to write because I just essentially wrote this really long list of questions about each stage of life that I thought would be interesting to take a neuroscience perspective of. And so that book came out in So I wrote it during 2016, 2017. And the very exciting thing is I'm now writing a second edition update that's going to come out again next year. And what has even changed and what the research has added to since, within the sort of the last 7 or 8 years is extraordinary as well. I'm going to have to be doing an update every 5 years. So that's kind of how I got into that space. It was from that article in 2015.
So what did you learn about the brain and menopause as you were doing this process?
Oh gosh, it's interesting. And it's hard and interesting. I'm updating the menopause chapter right now, so it's a really good time to be thinking about it. To be thinking about what we know now compared to what we knew in 2015, 16, 17 is changed a lot. So I suppose I always try when I'm writing and when I'm thinking about this. So I first of all try to take a big picture perspective, like what are our definitions? Because we have to get our definitions very clear and precise if we want to operationalize them using neuroscience. So, what are the stages of menopause? What are the ages? What are the kind of, 100% of women will go through this, but what if we're talking about symptoms? What are these symptoms? Who experiences them? So I try to be kind of very clear and precise with that overview. And then when I'm looking at the brain, so there's a couple of different ways we can think about the brain and menopause. We can kind of zoom out and look at like the whole brain. And now we've got great brain imaging. We can do that. We couldn't do that even 20 years ago. How does the brain change in structure during menopause? And of course, this menopause transition includes perimenopause and all of the hormone changes, and then it includes postmenopause. So we can look at how the brain changes over that time and structure. We can look at how different brain networks change and connect and communicate and what we see there. And then we can go, well, what do we understand about the symptoms? And a lot of the symptoms of menopause or perimenopause and menopause, things like hot flashes, all the thermoregulation issues, brain fog, that's very commonly reported, as I learned in 2015, anxiety and depression. A lot of these are neurological. And so what do we understand about what's happening during this menopause transition that might be giving rise to these neurological symptoms? So then that's interesting to take a look at. We probably understand most clearly hot flashes and vasomotor symptoms. We understand how they're related then to sleep. And then there's this whole kind of weird domino effect and clustering of symptoms, because then it becomes very hard to tease out, is brain fog a standalone symptom, or is that due to disrupted sleep, which is due to hot flashes? Similarly with, mood, is that due to disrupted sleep, which was due to hot flashes? Does mood compound brain fog? Does brain fog? And so we've got like symptoms that kind of cluster and interact. So that's really interesting from a neuroscience perspective to take a look at. And then, of course, we've got hormone therapy. So, just even that simple question I asked in 2015, will hormone therapy give us dementia, or will it cure dementia? And we still don't really know that answer. What do we understand about? And then from this bigger picture perspective as well, there's a lot of chatter, as you'll be very aware of, around, and we're all so different, and there's not this sort of standardized experience of menopause. There's not this typical symptom profile that all women experience. Everyone is so different. And so much of that may depend on your experiences of puberty and pregnancy and motherhood and the menstrual cycle and, your hormone sensitivity, the culture and society you live in, your thoughts and expectations, your overall physical health. So trying to take all of that and then tell this neuroscience story about menopause is what I try and do. And then I try and do that for like every phase of life. So so you have to be quite systematic, I've learned. You kind of got to sort of operationalize your definitions, be very clear on your data, zoom out, take a big picture look, then zoom in and go, what do we understand? That's causing these changes. What's the kind of the projection forward as well in terms of health? And what I try and do is I talk to the experts, I talk to the researchers, I talk to the scientists, I read their papers. I've got quite a protocol that I follow. And updating the book has been fun because I've got quite a good baseline knowledge now. And there's been a lot of research that's been done in the last 5-8 years. There's a lot of conversations and chat, so I just try and ignore all of the wild world of social media gurus and celebrities and just go, who are the best scientists that I can go and speak to? And then I Zoom them and have really long, thoughtful conversations. And that is, and because I can read their research, but to make sure I am interpreting their research and getting like the words from their own mouth as well is super useful. So I've learned all kinds of things about menopause, but that's sort of my approach.
So what does the world, although people don't, what do you know and do the world know now that we didn't know 5 years ago?
I think there's still lots we don't know. What I suppose, if I'm just thinking about what we understand now quite clearly, which is not necessarily between 5 years ago, even if we say 20 years ago, we understand very clearly what is happening in our brains with hot flashes and the role that hormones shifting during perimenopause and menopause play in that. So we understand that in our hypothalamus, we have like a thermostat, which has got a top level and a bottom level, just like a thermostat in your heater or in your house. So when you get too hot, there are actions that your brain takes, signals that it sends out to your body to cool you down. And so some of those are physiological, like you dissipate heat, you get red and you get hot and you sweat. And some of those are behavioral. So you take your clothes off, or you have a cold drink of water, or if you're asleep, unfortunately, you wake up and throw your bed covers off. Very, very unfortunately, when you are asleep and you are too hot, if your brain will try really hard with all of the physiological signals, doing all of this, but sometimes it then needs to wake you up to behave, and sometimes you might be really asleep. And so what it does is it kind of sends like this sort of sympathetic, like kind of signal through your body. So you often, women like wake up with quite like almost a panic, with quite like an adrenaline burst, and then they'll feel their heat and then they'll throw the covers off. So we've kind of got, as I said, we've kind of got some domino effects there. There are some women, my mother was one of those who actually, her cold thermostat was also quite affected. So she gets very, very hot very easily, also very, very cold. It's like set level is pretty narrow. I think she's getting better at managing it. She's now in her mid-70s. God love her. So we understand that, and we know that hormones can tweak and reset that because we've got a very clear proof of principle. If we reintroduce hormones back in with hormone therapy, then that thermostat resets, and we understand that because that is the best treatment for vasomotor symptoms. We've also then, in the last 5 years, and really within the last year or two, we've got these new drugs which have been developed which specifically target the neurons in the hypothalamus, which are involved with this kind of hot flash, this thermoregulation system. And there's these neurons, and they've got this very cute name. They're called candy neurons because they're like there's kisspeptin, neurokinin, dynorphin neurons. And they've got a very cute origin story, which I do tell in my book. They were first discovered by a researcher working in Hershey in Pennsylvania, where the Hershey's chocolate kiss factory is. So he called it this protein kisspeptin, and kisspeptin neurons after Hershey's kisses. Oh. And so the little collection of the three neurons then get called candy because they're K-N-D-Y. So it's a cute little name. And so we now understand the role they kind of play in thermoregulation and how they become dysregulated during menopause. So we can put hormones back in to re-regulate them. And women who don't want to take hormones, you don't need to take hormones, or women who can't take hormones, and there's lots of women who can't, then there are these other drugs that sort of tweak those neurons in that thermoregulation system and help women with their hot flashes. And they're very, very good drugs, but they're only just kind of coming on the market, and I'm not sure, which depends where you are in the world, whether you can get them on your PBS or your NHS, or whether you've got to pay out of pocket still.
I know there was one that was for vasomotor symptoms. It was approved recently in the US and the UK.
Yeah. It's been within the last
one that I know of. I can't. Can't remember.
And I believe here in Australia, one was only approved earlier this year, which is really good because we have a very clear understanding about the role that vasomotor symptoms play in overall health, long-term cardiovascular health, and also potentially perhaps long-term brain health, because they are a risk factor in and of themselves. They're not just a symptom, they're also a risk factor for longer-term health outcomes. So we really want to kind of get them well managed. And also they're disrupting sleep. And if you're disrupting sleep, then everything else falls apart. And I think we do have a tendency perhaps to not recognise that sleep is kind of sitting in the middle there. Those sleep disturbances are contributing to the brain fog, and they're contributing to the mood disorders. And then they all then contribute to each other. If you were depressed, your sleep is worse. If your sleep is worse, you're depressed. Becomes a vicious cycle. So if we can treat these vasomotor symptoms, we understand that neuroscience clearly, then we're so much further ahead. So it's best that we've got lots of options. So people like to argue about, should we be talking about cognitive behavioural therapy for menopause? Well, one of the best treatments we know for disrupted sleep is cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia. It might not stop hot flashes, but there might be women who might like to choose that as a way to help them sleep better. So I just think
it might give them the snowball other impacts that CBT can give us as well in terms of overall mental health and managing.
But CBT for insomnia is very specific, and it's very clearly designed just to treat.
Oh, is it?
And it's a CBT for insomnia. It's usually CBT with a little I. So it's very specific, and it's around psychoeducation and teaching all about sleep and teaching you how to manage that. Now, that's not to say it's a replacement, but I think the more tools that we've got in our toolbox and the more options women have got and evidence about these options and discussions about these options, then all the better.
You see, I would also add, the diet aspect, how much caffeine are you having, how much alcohol and sugar and all.
Absolutely.
Because all of that's going to disrupt your sleep.
Absolutely.
And cause hot flushes.
All of the lifestyle. But in terms of that very clear sequence of vasomotor disruptions, sleep disruptions, and then the mood and the brain fog. And what we see, so we were talking kind of before this began, there's a researcher who I just like, I worship. There's not many researchers I think are goddesses, but she's one of them, Pauline Mackey. She's at University of Illinois in Chicago, and she has spent her entire career, women's brain health psychiatrist. Her entire career is around brain fog and menopause and cognition and these changes, and she's done lots of trials and research. This is really her jam. And she would be a very big advocate of saying like that the vasomotor symptoms are really important. We understand so much of the neurobiology around that, but the sleep really is kind of at the core here. And I think it's very tempting to think, well, my mood changes are due to estrogen or no estrogen, and so if I put estrogen back in, I'll get better. But there might be a more complicated kind of sequence of events that got you there. Or it might be very tempting to go, well, the reason I've got brain fog is because I haven't got enough estrogen, so I'll put estrogen back in and my brain fog will go away. And again, we understand that we've got a much more complicated sequence, and we often have this kind of clustering of different symptoms. She's done this amazing work where she's looked at kind of charting, doing lots and lots and lots of cognitive tests on women. You can do all different kinds of cognitive tests, from looking at processing speed to verbal memory and recall and numeracy, and there's lots and lots of different kinds of ways you can measure cognition. And she's looked at sort of 80 or 90 women and charted them all the way through their menopause transitions. So it's very dense sampling. And then we've got all of these great tools and techniques now with like sort of AI and machine learning. And she's been able to kind of cluster these groups of women, which I think is so important. I did hear a researcher the other day say something about putting women in buckets, and it was on an Instagram post, and then everyone just moaned about, why are we putting women in buckets? Who wants to put women in buckets? It's like, well, it's just a term that we would use where we're talking about groups of women. And
there's no room for nuance on social media.
Subgroups of women. So we've got some, a fair proportion of women just kind of go the whole way through their menopause transition. They don't have any symptoms. They don't have any, just this stuff fine. They just kind of go from, 40 to 60 and not a lot changes. They're getting older during that time, so you've got 20 years of aging. But we're not really kind of picking up cognitive changes. Other women perhaps they've got, had a rough start in life, low socioeconomic, terrible levels of education through no fault of their own, poor overall health, terrible sleep, terrible vasomotor symptoms. They're the ones that where we see like very, significant changes, and statistically significant and perhaps even clinically significant changes in their cognition. And then we've got other women when going through perimenopause especially, where maybe they've got some symptoms, perhaps not terribly severe, or maybe just hot flashes, or maybe sleep disturbance. And we might start to see in those women changes in their cognitive test scores, or maybe just they feel foggy, but we're not really picking up any clinical change at all. What we often see is the more times you test someone on a cognitive test, the better your score gets each time you test on it.
I see that with my mother when she gets tested on a memory. She knows what the test is.
Doesn't matter how old you are. I've done once did tests on this French woman who was 118 years of age, and over the year her test scores got better. So you can still, it doesn't matter, you can be 118, your test scores get better. What Pauline Mackey has seen with women going through the perimenopause is their test scores might not improve. So they're not declining, but they're not seeing that the improvement that you get with practice. Yes. And what they sometimes see is on scores of verbal memory and recall, on average, women are better at that than men. Like average group of men, average group of women. And what you would see is that the women's test scores are just kind of the same as men's during that perimenopause. And then when they get postmenopause, it all kind of bounces back. So we've got different kinds of paths that women are going through. So there's not just this kind of one experience. And then what's really interesting is when we're looking at groups of women, it's not just about women who don't have symptoms, pat them on the back and go, well done you, which has been said here in Australia publicly by a politician. It's about actually what's really interesting at looking at the women who perhaps do sail through. What do we understand about them and their lives and their reproductive history? Are they taking hormones or not? Have they had lots of babies or not? Did they have a rough start to life or not? Have they just got a really high level of education? Is their health and well-being, they're ticking every box? It's super interesting to look at people who don't have symptoms as much as it is to take care of and be interested in the women who don't, because that's how we're going to understand what is going on.
Oh, I love that. I absolutely love that because, it's so important. And yet we wallow in the negativity. We wallow in the really difficult end.
Well, we do. And that's important because we don't, but I think we need to be
Yes, it's important. But
we need to be
about
very
balance,
careful,
isn't it?
Yeah, because, I was listening in on all of that. I didn't go to the International Menopause Society conference. It was here in Melbourne, in Australia, a few weeks ago, but I've listened into a lot of the recordings. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it. And there were some really interesting conversations about all sorts of things. But there was one really interesting one that I listened into, discussions around menopause in the workplace, because that's like the big thing, is like everyone should be talking about menopause in the workplace. I work for myself, so I talk about it all day long. But if I was in I was still in the research lab, I don't know whether I'd be wanting to talk about menopause to everyone all of the time. And I don't think that's what it's about. But I do think we can't just go, everyone should be talking about menopause in the workplace all of the time, because we need to be very careful about, one, supporting people who aren't perhaps doing so well, but recognizing gendered ageism and being very careful and thoughtful about how we have conversations. Because if we only focus on deficits, we're not focusing also on the potential strengths. So what is the point in having someone in the workplace who's over 50 if they're a woman? Because we're just going to be forgetful and faffing about and useless if the only conversation about midlife is about the negative symptoms. We need to also recognise the flip side of gendered ageism. And I guess what we're seeing is what we always see. We see a big shift one way in response to a big shift that was, we just see these swings about, and eventually it will find a happy and, I hope, evidence-based medium whereby we've tested what works. If we're going to talk about menopause in the workplace, can we go in and test what messages land, what work? And that is being done. we need to be very careful and thoughtful about it, to get that balance right for everyone.
But there's so much scaremongering around, isn't there? There is, and that's what worries me. So it's a joy for me to talk to, a scientist who knows this thing, and and you were talking about that you want to access the science, and you've talked about the need for nuance and context, and that is what so often gets lost. And I love
it doesn't drive the social media algorithms.
No, it doesn't.
Like being thoughtful and careful, and I try really hard on social media to do that, to be thoughtful and careful, and to but I the taking a biopsychosocial lifespan perspective, and perhaps trying to talk about different women having different experiences and being interested in all of that's not very catchy. That took me ages to say that sentence, right?
But it's important. Oh my goodness. We first connected, didn't we? On social media, on LinkedIn, because we both were concerned about the big statements being made about menopause and suicide. And I've researched that, and I've looked at the actual statistics, and you have too. And the big sweeping statements that are made, they're not backed up by the statistics, are they?
No, I think there was unfortunately a sweeping statement made, and I understand it's hard. Perhaps if you're on stage or you're on a podcast, and I do this all of the time, we try and be clear and precise and concise. I was just doing work earlier today, and it was trying to distill this enormous piece of research down into some like catchy little sound bites on film, on camera. And it's really hard to do. But I think when we're talking about something as important as suicide, and we've got, the media, we have very, very clear here in Australia guidelines about how to discuss that and report that. So we can't make sweeping statements. And the sweeping statement was that the highest rates of suicide that we're seeing, and now I'm paraphrasing and summarising, was something like the highest rates of suicide are in women going through menopause. And the claim was meaning to say that menopause women at the highest suicide risk of anyone else in the population, which we know, one, is incorrect, because we know that men at every age and stage of life have a much, much higher risk. And it definitely gave the impression that menopausal women well overtook men. We know that there's a peak of men in midlife, but the highest peak is people over the age of 80. God love them. They've probably just got to the end and thought, well, I don't know what the reasons are for that, but there's very clear statistics for males, very clear statistics for females. And if you look at it annually, like we look at each of the ages, and you don't want to be thinking about kids and teenagers either, do you? You don't want to think about this at any age. But some years there might be like this kind of slight bump, but we might be talking about, it could be like there could be 7 cases of suicide per 100,000 women in their 30s, and then in their 40s it might be something like 9, and then their 50s it could be back to 7 in 1 year. Well, that 2 cases per 100,000 in that 1 year, in that age, in that decade, doesn't mean menopause is causing women to commit suicide. It just meant in that 1 year there was a tight bump. But then we've got to look at the next year, and we've got to look at the previous years, and we've got to look at overall trends. We cannot make sweeping statements, particularly about something as important. There are very, very clear public health messages that need to be out there about suicide risk and about mental health, but making sweeping statements like that, I think, was incredibly damaging, and it was the wrong use of the data. The data was completely misinterpreted, and so I went on. I was actually working kind of behind the scenes with someone else I know who knows this kind of work really well, but she wasn't kind of prepared to be out there, and so we were very careful in. And I don't like to use the word debunking, but we debunked that claim on LinkedIn and some comments there. And then I believe you popped in with the UK sort of statistics. Yeah. And then to the credit of it was a women's health group, they actually came back and apologised and said that they were going to remove the the video that was saying that. And I think that's how, and it's interesting because sometimes you can't debunk with facts and figures and stats. People actually are far more swayed by, emotions and stories and things.
Yes.
But I think sometimes it's very important to do and to do well. And I see this in all of the work I do. People we just usually use these words like risk. And in my book, and it's probably a little bit of a boring bit in the book, but I don't really care because it's important. I try and explain the difference between relative risk and absolute risk, and numbers needed to treat. Yes. We can talk about this and everything, and I think I talk about it when I'm talking about the risk of developing depression if you were taking the oral contraceptive pill, if you're an adult, say, versus if you're a teenager. So what's the relative risk is usually comparing two groups. So it could be something like a 50% increase or a 50% decrease, but that's between comparing two groups. It never says anything about an individual. So we need to also translate those statistics to be absolute risk. We have this saying, absolutely report absolute risk. This is a little mantra in health and medical journalism. But then we need to then rephrase that into language that people understand. We can't say, there's a 4% increased risk for you as an individual if you're on the pill, if you're 16 years old. It's far better to say, if we had 100 16-year-olds, 4 of those 100 might develop depression on the pill. And if we looked at 100 girls who were not on the pill, 2 might develop. We have, that's not the exact numbers, but that's how we need to be very careful. And that's what I try and do all of the time, which again is not catchy and soundbitey. There are ways and tricks around it. And then going in and occasionally, I don't do this very often because social media just turns into a shit show in the comments. But if I see something where I know that the statistics are being misused to scaremonger or conflate ideas, I will go like the statistics, and I've gone in and challenged some other things. Not often.
I would just like to say thank you, because I think it's so important, and I think there are so many people out there who have certain narratives, and they overinflate everything. Not everything. I'm overinflating everything by saying overinflating everything, but they overinflate a lot. And there is an agenda. There is a sales agenda. If you tell everybody that people are leaving work because of menopause, then there's a whole industry that can be built out of people going into businesses who are terribly worried they're going to lose their women and consulting and helping them.
That menopause in the workplace statistic was interesting because the conference here in Melbourne, there's a researcher who's looked at that, and she went in and she said, well, some women are saying they were thinking about leaving, but the percentage of women that do is tiny. But now there's a menopause in the workplace industry, which I think is good, but I still think that perhaps doing a lunch and learn about menopause symptoms is useful, but also we need women to be talking to their doctors about healthcare issues as well. And they said we need, particularly with menopause, because of the age issue. And once, you don't want to you just don't want to inflate and hype up this gendered ageism. We've got
I think people forget the gendered ageism. I think that's massive. And I think
it's a massive
it's just as important as menopause in the workplace. And what happens is that you've got people now ticking the menopause in the workplace box, and they're not thinking about actually what we really need to be tackling is the gendered ageism. Menopause is now the scapegoat.
I think it will swing back. I think everything does. It's just having this moment in time. And so I'm hoping it'll swing back.
I hope it will too. I hope it will too. But it's worrying because you'll know that, anxiety and fear doesn't feed into good brain health, does it?
No, absolutely not.
If you wind people up and get them all nervous.
Well, I mean, I think, for me, it's a little bit clearer if I talk about, baby brain as well, because that book's out there and that's published, that there's this enormously common cultural story about pregnancy and motherhood and baby brain, that we become forgetful and, kind of lose our minds, and everyone's like laughing and joking about that. But again, if we go in and we look very carefully at pregnancy, because it's a very different state than early motherhood, and we do all of our cognitive testing, we follow groups of women through. Typically, when we follow groups of women through, each individual woman, we're not picking up cognitive decline during pregnancy. We're not picking up cognitive decline during motherhood. Sometimes in some studies, some women might show, like, instead of scoring 18 or 19 out of 20 on a test of verbal recall, they might score like 17 in the third trimester of pregnancy. So there's this one moment in time when some studies pick up this tiny shift. And typically when we pick up these shifts in these cognitive tests, say at any point when we're looking at over the menstrual cycle, when we're looking at males, females, when we're looking at the pill, it's typically around verbal recall, particularly for women. Men have got all of it's all about testosterone and sort of spatial rotation. That's a very strong signal there. So we've got 4 out of 5 women saying, I've got baby brain. And then we're going, well, actually, it's probably, we're not picking that up. There's not this kind of clinical syndrome going on here. But when we look actually at what's going on, we've got new mums particularly, you've got your new baby. What does memory depend on? It depends on attention. Your brain has reorganized to focus your attention and reading your baby's cues and figuring out how to look after this baby. Your entire attention is tuned into them. You're probably also very, very tired. Of course, you're not going to remember to buy bananas or wash your husband's undies or the keys, or whether your child had to wear a sports uniform today instead of a school uniform. You're not remembering all of that. You're not paying attention to all of that. And a lot of baby brain is around that mental load, that cognitive labor of motherhood. So it's not women's neurobiology that's letting them down. It is this expectation that we still should be able to do it all, but actually our brains are busy doing something else far more important. So, but we've just been told to expect baby brain. And so then if you forget all of the things, then you just go, oh, don't worry about me. It's just my baby brain. Well, we just believe it's something wrong with ourselves, when actually it's perhaps we won't get enough help around the house. And so we've got this enormous expectation set up, but we've primed girls from puberty that if you combine your brain with some hormones and some life transition, whether it be your period, whether it be pregnancy, whether it be menopause, it's going to automatically equal cognitive dysfunction and decline. And we're almost expecting it, and we're waiting for it in the tiniest little sign. We're focusing everything on that, and then assuming everyone is having this drastically dreadful time of it. And I think it's far more important. What I like to do is like, let's take a step back. Let's look at our definitions. How can we look at those definitions through this lens of neuroscience very, very clearly and carefully? Have we got these subgroups of women with these different experiences? And what we're definitely seeing coming through in the last few years is we've definitely got hormone-sensitive women. Maybe they're the women who went through puberty early. There's a bit of a signal there. They're perhaps women who have PMDD or serious PMS. Perhaps they were more vulnerable during pregnancy. They had perinatal depression. They're perhaps the ones that are going to be more likely to struggle when they're going through menopause. So we've got that sort of group of women that we really need to keep an eye on. And then we've got other women who just like are impervious, they're like the dandelions, that just don't notice anything, just kind of carry on through life. And it's interesting to look at those. And then we've got lots of women kind of sitting in between. And if we assume that every celebrity's, terrible experience of their life draining away, or being hit by a truck or whatever celebrity doctor is flogging their clinic for thousands of dollars an appointment, or their supplements, they're only going to focus on those women who are really seriously suffering. And then we're all expected to all share that experience. And there's almost this kind of like weird sort of misuse of feminism, that we're all meant to kind of be in it together. And if you're kind of going, well, maybe I'm all right, maybe I've done, you're perhaps not sharing that.
Then you're letting the side down.
Better not say anything, because you're letting the side down, and you're dismissing women's experience. And
yes. Oh yeah.
no one's muzzling anyone.
I get that all the time.
Or dismissing anyone's experiences. For me personally, I don't have an agenda. I just really think the neuroscience is interesting. So what I try to do is just, as I said, I feel like I've got this kind of grid of like life and different types of women and these different, kind of stages we go through. And I'm just really interested in taking that big picture perspective of all of that and describing it calmly and carefully, rather than hyping it all up, because it's too interesting to hype up. It's so interesting. I was talking to this researcher this morning, Adriana Belts, and she works specifically in looking at oral hormonal contraceptives and menstrual cycle and cognition and brain health and mood disorders. She's so fascinating. We were like, I always say, like, if you could design, like, give you $1 billion check, how would you design the perfect study? And we were saying what would be great is if we get 100,000 newborn babies and then track all of these questions that we've got about every kind of stage of life. Are you going on the pill? Are you getting pregnant when you're young or when you're old or whatever? And then fast forward these 100,000 humans through to they're 100 years of age, but we did it in a year. And then we've got all of the data. Then all of the data's there. We've got the well-designed longitudinal study. We've got all of the questions preset. That's the problem, is that we're trying to put together this puzzle piece with all of these different studies and all of these different types of women. A lot of them are, wealthy white ladies. We're not diverse in any aspect of that. And the best type of study is a longitudinal study where we follow a big group of people through. Well, that study, if we designed it now, would take 100 years. So me and Adrian will be long gone. But that's where the gaps are, and the gaps just get filled. The gaps are always going to get filled with someone flogging a supplement, some new Hollywood celeb will spot a gap in the market and off they'll go.
Ugh, I love it. I love it. I love it. It's very powerful stuff. And I just love the idea, we have to take a step back. We have to look at the big picture. So we could talk about this forever, but I know we can't do that. So what would you most like midlife women to know?
I think we're taking it quite seriously at the moment. It would be. I saw someone share something on social media the other day. Sharon Horgan's Bad Sisters, that Irish. They've just got series 2 out and coming out, and in that someone has a menopause coach. And one of the older ladies just laughs at her. And I thought, I'm so glad Sharon Horgan is taking the piss out of midlife and menopause. I know lots of women have a terrible time, but can we not lose our sense of humour in amongst all of this? It's become very tribal and very mean and infighting. It feels a bit like high school. I just think, what a shame, because I know so many cool women my age, and some have got hot flashes and some are on hormones and some are not, and I've got friends in their late 40s who've got primary school kids and kids who are getting married, and we're just this rich, cool group of women, and there's such a cool life ahead of us all, and we're just wallowing around and bitching and moaning about who said what and who on social media, and we've just lost our sense of humour. So I think I think we should all take a leaf out of Sharon Horgan's humour book and take a bit of a laugh at ourselves and at the whole situation. And I will be. I think that's actually coming out today. I now sound like I'm doing an advert for her, for Bad Sisters. So there's that. And then, just all of the other life, and it's so boring to talk about lifestyle, but I live in they just did this thing in Australia where they looked at each suburb in Australia and looked to see where was the kind of highest overall well-being, which was to do to things like socioeconomic impact, and health and well-being and access to services and education and schools and the natural environment. And I happen to live in the suburb in Australia with the highest level of well-being out of the whole country. So it is very easy for me to talk about my lifestyle, the context we live in is so important. And I think we need to also understand when we give lifestyle advice, like, oh, it's very easy, I'll just go down and have a swim in the beach, and then I'll, go to my book club and have a chat, and then I'll come home and I'll go watch my kids play sport. I mean, that's all very easy for me to say because I'm very aware of where I live enables me to live this great and wonderful life, and not everyone has that. So whilst I would like to say, think about all of the lifestyle boxes to tick, sometimes that's a hard ask. That feels like another thing for lots of people to do. So I will be cautious about offering too much lifestyle advice, apart from, I think we're under-recognising, perhaps potentially, and I don't want to use the word under-treating, but under-recognising this fundamental importance of sleep. And so we've got sleep kind of at the core of all of this. And if we can focus in at this point in life on protecting sleep, I think we'll be doing ourselves a great service, both for how we feel, how we think, and then how we're going to age going forward. So whatever we can throw at the sleep issue, I think is perhaps this big hub that's sitting in the middle of it all.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow, and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife, Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause, and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.